they fall very quickly in love, as you do when you're 20. But when they move to London to start the next chapter of their lives, Ming comes out as trans. And so what starts as a relationship between two gay men becomes something else. And Tom and Ming are forced to reckon with what Ming's transition means for their relationship and how they move forward and how their loves might transform. So I think what often surprises people is that Tom's perspective is sort of the genesis of the novel. And I think when people hear about a novel which might involve someone transitioning, the natural conclusion one might draw is that it's told from the trans character's perspective. But as a trans person myself and someone whose profile aligns quite closely with that of Ming's, I found it more interesting to kind of view transitioning as something a bit more interpersonal and see what it's like to transition from someone else's eyes. And so Tom's passages sort of started and initially were about 75% of the book. But as I moved through further iterations of the novel, I found myself including more and more of Ming's voice. And I'd say of the two, Ming's voice is sort of closest to my own, and her experiences I definitely reflect my own, which I think as an author, you always want to, or there's sometimes I find as an author, I like to have a barrier up where I say, oh, no, this is totally fiction.
Yeah.
But I also can't deny that, that the authenticity of that experience definitely is borrowed from my own life. And, how I know that the book effectively represents a trans experience is that it's drawn from my own experience as a trans person in this world. I'm not sure that Bellies would have been published with the reception that it has today, maybe sort of 10, 20 years ago. I think there was definitely a certain readiness in audiences for this kind of fiction. I think a lot of trans people and queer people have been waiting for these stories to appear in mainstream publishing for a really long time. So it's not that the demand wasn't there, but I think it took a while for the demand to filter in to, every rung of the publishing ladder, and for people to fully believe that stories like mine, like what I've written in Bellies, are viable. I think Bellies is sort of maybe a bit more distinct from, or rather, it's sort of distinct from previous books written by trans writers in the UK, in that it centers a trans person of color, and most of the characters in the book are people of color as well. And so I'm hoping that also has sort of an expanding effect on the types of stories from trans people of all backgrounds. I feel like when I was reading books when I was younger, I definitely would identify with a lot of the characters that I was reading on an emotional level, but they weren't necessarily of the same background that I was in. And it's something I'm very used to. I also think that that's sort of the power of fiction, is that you're able to empathize with characters who are quite different from you. I don't think, a book like Bellies would even have traction if that wasn't possible. I think the audience for it hasn't just been queer and trans people. It's been, straight people in their 70s sometimes come up to me and tell me how familiar it felt to them, and how different yet familiar it felt, which is always quite a wonderful feeling when you are reminded of fiction's power in that respect. The best fiction exists in those two spaces at once, or maybe presents the familiar in an unexpected way. I'll read from the first chapter, which is just after Tom and Ming have met, and it's told from Tom's perspective. And it's sort of a post-coital conversation between the two. We cleaned up and lay down next to each other under the covers. He curved his spine perpendicular to mine and placed his head on my chest, sliding down from my ribs and onto my stomach. "What are you doing?" I asked. "You can hear everything," he said. "Not in a gross way, but it's soothing. I used to lie on my mother's stomach when I was younger. Try it." He lifted his head and sat up. I placed my ear on his abdomen and listened to the low gurgles under his skin. The system beneath it seemed larger and more powerful than the belly of a boy. Ming stroked my hair, and his hand covered my ear. I shut my eyes. It was a dark and endless canyon, the deep, deep sea, outer space. Do you think you'll do drag again? He asked. I lifted my head and lay down next to him. I don't know, I said. I didn't like it. Will you? He shut his eyes and yawned, one hand holding mine and the other over his chest. Yeah, he said, I feel more confident in my body when I do it. Do you not like your body normally? Does anyone? I met this with silence. I didn't love my body, but to me, my body was just that, a body. I thought of how Sarah used to stand at the mirror, pinching love handles and complaining about her short legs. I'd offer reassurances in the way I thought boyfriends were supposed to. You have lovely long legs, maybe even the longest I've ever seen. Please don't change. How about when you're in drag? I asked. He yawned again, drawing his thumb back and forth against mine. It sort of stops feeling like my body, like I don't feel as self-conscious. That's weird. He stayed silent. His thumb went slack. I regretted my tone. You have a beautiful body, I said. He opened his eyes and smiled at me. We held our faces close. Let's go to bed, he said. His fingers gripped the switch of the lamp and clicked us into darkness. We shuffled deeper beneath the duvet, and I fell into a dreamless sleep. Ming shifted on the bed when I woke up the next morning. We weren't touching. The light of the room poked through my eyelids. I peeled them open. My head faced the wooden bedside table, and I studied the chips in its coat of white paint. The glass of beer I'd set down was still there. A hairline rim of bubbles ran along the edge of the beer's surface, neither popping nor dissolving, held in stasis. A gust of wind blew through the window and across my cheek. It hit the glass, and the bubbles began to wobble. When you write a book that in any way reflects aspects of your life, people really try to see themselves in the book, and maybe even in instances where that's not the case. And it's something I felt very conscious of when publishing the book, because, many events worth writing about are rarely private property. And, it's often the case that more than one person feels as if they have some sense of ownership over the event. And so when you're drawing from life experiences, it's sort of inevitable that other people will feel as if you're writing their experiences as well. And it's hard to know exactly what the rule book is to write entirely responsibly in that regard. I think, writers could talk about this for hours and hours and hours and still not be able to prepare a rule book. And, as far as I know, there's no rule book available, because I really, would have valued having a copy. It actually appears in the book as well, about halfway through, Ming writes a play about her and Tom's relationship. Yeah. And that's something that Tom finds incredibly difficult. And it's very much sort of a meta-analysis of my own process of thinking about how people will receive the book being published. So while on the whole it's been positive, it's definitely never without friction. And I imagine it's something, for as long as I write fiction that's based in sort of contemporary reality, I'll continue to face again.
It's a book that took 7 years to write. It's a book that explores the aftermath, the death of a long-term partner, same-sex partner. And it reads a little bit like a novel insofar as it's got a linear narrative. It's sort of like a novel in poems. The first half of the book looks at grief and bereavement in those first few days, the practicalities, the things you have to do, the rituals, the performances you go through, looking at the language of bureaucracy and death admin, the professionals you meet along the way. It's very much a book about people. And then it goes on to, stuff, clearing a flat, trying to get rid of things, emptying a space. It does all of this in a kind of sort of risk-taking way. There are sorrowful poems, sad poems, but also quite a lot of absurd and comic poems. around this theme of bereavement. The second half of the book then goes back and explores the relationship, some of the tensions within a long-term relationship, the travel, the cohabitation. And then towards the end of the book, actually contemplates, explores what it is to write on death and grief when you know you're putting this work out into the world. So very conscious of the kind of of the poems, actually thinking about the writing of the book and the publishing. So there is a slight remove, but certainly the poems from the beginning of the book are the most difficult to read because it's dealing with the immediacy and the shock and not really knowing how to cope in those first few days. But obviously, what I've tried to do is take the personal and what's been very painful and again, turn it into something universal. Angle poise. You'll be in the front room at your computer, surrounded by your family of angle poise lamps. The novel will be making steady progress. I'll be in the kitchen with my laptop and radio, editing some poem or other, devoting an hour to the question of a comma, semicolon, full stop. Voices will drift up to me from where you are. My drama will drift down the hallway to you. There'll be hot radiators and rugs, curtains drawn. We'll both be home, absorbed in our projects, each working our way through the bottle of red. I'll be alive. You'll be alive. It'll be like old times. The thesis. It was June and I had to see a student. A Tuesday morning and I had to see several students. I knew something was wrong. I called and asked a friend for help. I was far away and I had to see a student. She said she'd go round and ring the bell. I tried to listen to the mouth of the student. He or she was seeking my approval. I knew something was wrong. It was June, and I was seeing a student. I gave some useful advice. I gave a smile. I knew something was wrong. I wished them well, saw off the student. The deadline was approaching for submitting the thesis. It was late morning, and I had to see a student. I sat across from a student, faced the thesis, and then across from another student. I waited for my friend's call. My friend was in London. I knew something wasn't right. I worked my way through the students. Signature. In his sleep, except he isn't really sleeping, that's just what we like to tell ourselves. He looks as if he's grinning, as if he knows something new, has seen a sight to comfort him and offer reassurance, so he can close his eyes for good. Or else he's understood once and for all what us lot don't, that this here is one massive joke, some lame farce from the beginning. I wouldn't be surprised because he had his own sense of humour. Black in the mishaps and embarrassment saw the human comedy, relishing the doddering and stumbling of others, their sticky situations, how they keep on talking, words making it worse, digging a hole for themselves. I look at his mouth and he's not saying much, but keeping stum, lips sealed, mums the word. And I'm positive, 100%, that he won't tell me what's tickling him. Not this time. I edge up, lean in and steep over, allow myself to touch his forehead, lay my palm flat on the long fringe, and with my thumb caress each brow, stroke them in the right direction, feel the love, cold and wet from refrigeration. And then the book moves on to explore the various, rituals, performances you have to go through. This one is called Collecting You from Golders Green. The young woman, lady, female, behind the desk, counter, reception, spoke gently, softly, calmly, seemed genuinely moved, emotional, upset, and I thought how generous, kind, ridiculous. For she never was acquainted with you. She checked her screen, monitor, computer, and vanished, took her leave, was gone. I sat on the sofa, couch, settee, looking, staring, glancing around the office, at the pot plant, cheese plant, cactus, until she came back, returned, reappeared. She was holding, carrying, balancing a large, sizable, ample brown container, receptacle, cardboard box, neatly, immaculately, pristinely sealed, with your name, surname, identifier, on a white label, sticker, square, in jet black. I got in the car, vehicle, motor, and sat, positioned, placed you, safely on my knees, legs lap. I felt the weight, pounds, load of you. As Jean drove, escorted, chauffeured me, away, to Highgate, to hers, home. The Hymn of Him. And this is a poem where I use a lot of constraints in the book, devices, experimental forms, constraints. So this is one where I'm just using the little 3-letter words to make a song. The ap of him, the bop of him, the cap, the cop of him, the cup of him, the dip, the fop of him, the gap of him, the hip, the hop of him, the jip of him, the lap, the lip of him, the map of him, the mop, the nap of him, the nip of him, the pep, the pip of him, the pup of him, the quip, the rap of him, the rep of him, the rip, the sap of him, the sip of him, the sup, the tap of him, the tip of him, the top, the VIP of him, the whip of him, the yap, the yep of him, the zap of him, the zip, the ship of him, the shop of him, the shut up, the chap of him, the chip of him, the chop. And I'll just go through to the end of the book and read a couple. I can be happily engrossed in some, have my head stuck in looking out at the, noticing the new, admiring the curve of, fixed on the weigher, lost in the recent and oblivious too. I can be enjoying a quiet, browsing the latest, choosing between or flicking through, taking in all the, catching up on my, touching base with, planning an overdue. I can be peering over at, preparing a small, getting ready for, in the queue, looking forward to, when suddenly I, out of nowhere, picture you. The last poem in the book, the prologue poem, this poem's towards the end about, this whole notion of writing a book, knowing this is going to go out into the world.
Huh.
But I'll just read this last poem. I went down to the middle of France. I'd kind of written the manuscript really, and I was going to a wedding to one of his friends' weddings actually. So I was going on his behalf in a way. And I found myself in this glorious little boutique bed and breakfast, and I was the only guest. And this is a poem that's really, I think, about the physicality of writing with a pen and paper. Wedding in Limousin. I'm writing this in the swimming pool, in a swimming pool in which I am the only swimmer. I've stopped swimming to write this poem, here alone, just arrived, my first swim. 3 trains and a taxi, 38 degrees, a June heat wave. Standing here, cooling off, the robot cleaning underwater, almost company. A pen is letting out its ink, a notebook covered in wet patches from my wet arm, right hand. Blotched words. Sun hot on my back, the blanks of paper wrinkling into waves. France. Sound of a tractor, and a moment ago, church bells. A breeze. Honeysuckle. All this way. I've come to represent you. But I'm also here for me. Hey, a swallow just skimmed the pool, was off again. 6th in a row. A swallow for each year you've been gone. It's time to swim. I've been writing quite a bit, again, trying to use constraints. I've been experimenting a little bit with, WhatsApp and algorithms and live transcript captions and things like that. But also, I think writing in response to this book, exploring modern love, relationships, stroke situationships, togetherness, being separate and together. The complexities, I think, of modern love these days. With all the apps human relations are far more complex, aren't they? And relationships, polyamory, all of that. I think it's very interesting territory. So I'm trying to explore that.
So this is my fifth book. Yes, this is my fifth book. And I guess, I don't know, every time I talk about it, I guess I describe it in a different way. I think this time I'm gonna say it's sort of psychic journey from mourning because the protagonist's twin brother has died, to love and last, of course, and about all the different identities we try on when we move towards this kind of this kind of journey. And the protagonist is actually, she doesn't have a name. We don't know her name because her whole identity was actually based on her brother's identity, who is now dead. And so she has to find a new one for herself. She doesn't actually know where to find it. And that's why she moves to China, because his dream was to open a restaurant in China. And so she moves there to Shanghai, and she actually finds love. She meets this girl, and they start this really weird relationship where there's a lot of eating involved, which personally I don't find really strange. I know it can actually just sound strange because there's a lot of just paragraphs about like them sort of munching each other, and I think it's actually very close to what what actually love is, like in the first place. If you think about like a mother and a baby, that's how the baby actually learns love, by eating their mother, by being breastfed. And so it's a lot about that. I think there's a lot of primary feelings involved in this story, and which, I mean, these are always involved in love. And I'm very interested in what happens to your mind when you go through love, like how it actually changes you. Maybe for the better, maybe for the worse. It doesn't matter. What matters is that it like deeply affects you. And so actually the characters change a lot, and a lot of things happening, but at the same time nothing happens. It's like a journey of the mind, as I said. And so the plot is actually really slim, and I think the real plot is happening in the words. So it's like symbolic plots. It's a mind plot, I should say. When I was writing Blue Hunger, at the same time I was actually also translating Patricia Highsmith's diaries into Italian. I don't know how many pages she left, because they actually cut a lot of it, but now it's like this big, the final diary, and because it's basically her own life. And so while I was living inside her life, inside her words, and deciding as a translator how the Italian voice was going to be, which is, I felt a huge responsibility, because she actually sounds different when she talks. She uses different languages in the diary, because she didn't want her lover to read the diaries. So sometimes she writes in like French or German, and they sort of sound like secret codes. And then she writes in English, and throughout her life you can actually feel her changing through the writing. And it was really interesting to follow that and to find a voice with that. And of course, a lot of it was about her sexual identity, because she had an awful relationship with her mother, who didn't accept that she was gay. And at first, she didn't even want to talk about it with her. She was actually lying to herself. She actually went into some sort of conversion therapy through psychoanalysis. And what I think is really funny, that actually what this therapy did to her is that she wrote like her hugely famous lesbian novel because of the conversion therapy. So at least this horrible experience made her realize how she really needed to embrace herself. And that's how she came up with Carol. So it was really important to her that Carol had happy ending, because back then it was impossible to have a happy ending. Nobody would publish that. And so she actually, it was really difficult for her to find a publisher who would allow her to have the happy ending. And so this fight was really important. And it's the main reason why this novel is, so famous and so important. And still, you would expect after so many years for it, for a happy ending, for a sapphic novel to be like normal, like totally normal. But when you watch TV shows or even in literature, it's not always the case. There's actually still a lot of that narrative, because you actually unfortunately society needs a very long time to get rid of all the toxic traces of those things. It's still there. And so when I was writing the novel, I was like, even from the beginning, like even before I knew what was going on with the character, even before I knew the story, I knew that it was going to have a happy ending, because I felt this, political responsibility. And of course, because I knew that I wanted it to have a happy ending for political reasons, I wanted the whole narrative to make sense, because I knew there was going to be this happy ending in the horizon. And so I guess this allowed me to, explore all the grief they were going through and all the toxic traits of the relationship, because still I knew that there was going to be like a light at the end of the tunnel for them. So this is the first time the protagonist goes to Sue's apartment. The apartment was small, despite oversized windows, and it seemed familiar. The plastic table, the bright kitchen, the metal light fixtures. Maybe it seemed familiar because it contained simple furniture without character. It recalled the decor of a doctor's waiting room, chosen to keep destructive emotions like panic at bay. I wondered how many other girls had been there, holding Sue's cold hand in the elevator, and then coming to their apartment, feeling at home just because it was a house that could have been any other, feeling reassured merely by a combination of materials and colors that absorbed bad omens. Have you had a lot of girlfriends? I asked in Italian. I took refuge in my native tongue. Fidanzate, she echoed mockingly, as if it were the title of a cartoon. You're funny, so sentimental. I felt a rush of shame. Maybe I should have said it in English. In English, girlfriend can also mean friend. It's a bit safer. Ambiguity shields you from disappointment. In Chinese, 女朋友 is friend too. Among the languages Sue and I had in common, only Italian described relationships with such an unequivocally intimate word, sticky like hands intertwined under a bedsheet. Fidanzate, a word that derives from fiducia, faith, trust. In the bedroom, she switched on the lamp. I squinted to get a better look at her things. Piles of makeup, cupcake-shaped pillow, crumpled magazines on the floor. There was a darkness, tense and full of apprehension, like a sick child's room with the shades drawn. Could I open the window? Why? Should I turn down the air? It's a little musty in here. You can't open the windows. It's too smoggy outside. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I started to notice the food. Open bags of chips scattered across the floor, cups of juice, a half-eaten apple, browning in the hollow of a ripped armchair. Ramen twisted around the computer keyboard. Shimmering lychee, still fresh, mixed with plastic necklaces in a jewelry box. Sue, can I help you clean up? Clean up what? She looked at me perplexed. She took off her shoes. The food. Throw it away. You don't understand. I need it. I need it around. Now I could see everything. The brown bananas hanging on a wall hook, the snack cakes and dirty spoons, stalks of celery piled on top of a book, lollipops bright as roadside reflectors, chicken feet in a transparent bowl, bottles of plum wine and jars of glazed cookies, a pale pink cake caved in from the heat. Even before wondering what the purpose of all this was, this accumulation of food, this leaving it to molder and rot, I wondered how my brother would have salvaged some of it to create an incredible dish. A surprising, spicy confection, a revelation, a complicated, unrecognizable crap. But Ruben was gone, and all over the world, food was going bad, withering and darkening until it lost all shape and appeal. I undressed, nervous, as she undressed too. What are you looking at? She asked, her voice hard. Nothing. The food. Don't think I eat all that. It just keeps me company. I wasn't thinking that. I was thinking it's not sanitary. Look, I eat it, but then I throw up some of it. Being pretty is important to me. It's all I have. So don't worry. That's not what I meant. I was worried about hygiene. Just that you worry too much. Shut your mouth. Don't judge me. I'm not judging you. You're not listening. Shh. Our clothes dropped to the floor like fruit peels. Surrounded by plastic wrappers and straws, raspberries in little heaps on the rug, she crouched over me. I saw the mirror, a modern design with ribbons of red candy hung over it. I saw my midsection reflected there and thought that in Sue's mouth, it must have the texture of a chewy artificial confection, with predictable industrial sweetness, like the Italian snack cakes from my childhood. It was a new and strange thought, a thought inspired by the putrid embrace of all that leftover food. I imagined Sue vomiting it all up except for me, remaining inside there forever, undigested and safe. I laughed a lot loud as Sue approached, a hearty, liberating laugh. She took a cookie from the jar on the nightstand and popped it in her mouth. She turned to me, crumbs on her lips, and said, "Lie down." I fell back on the bed and she removed my bra, my only remaining garment. Her head hovering over me, she scrutinized my body. "Eat me," I said. The idea was mine. It was the first time I had a thought like that. I was the first to think of my body as brainless pulp. Eat me, make me yours, make me disappear. Something happened. Something inside me had worked loose, revealing a strange part of the mind. Sue took my breasts and bit my nipple. Was it just a metaphor, what I said to her? The ultimate metaphor for our relationship. I'm still trying to figure it out. But understanding is a cold exercise. Understanding is the opposite of hunger, the opposite of desire. Sue beat me again. A rivulet of dark blood, warm like chocolate sauce, trickled down my navel. "Go over there," she said, pointing to the window seat. She pushed the curtains aside. The blue flooded the room, a convulsion of aggressive, alternating light. I saw more food, brown strips of jerky in cellophane on the floor, a hard-boiled egg by the wall coated in dust and fuzz. Out the window, I saw the street we'd just taken here, the black cement and the corner stores. But it had become a street in another city. I leaned back, the glass against my shoulder blades. I sensed the oscillating blue rays on my cheeks and eyes. She resumed biting. They weren't affectionate or even passionate bites. They were cold, precise, like a surgeon trying to extract an object from the flesh. Her teeth moved from my chest down, lingering at the softer spots. Then I saw the photos. Photos everywhere, tacked to the walls, photos of girls on a bike by a river, on a pink bed, in a park, all pretty, though unkempt, all smiling. But the longer I looked at them, the farther I plunged toward orgasm. The more each grin seemed like an uneasy grimace. Then I saw the bracelet. 3 different girls were wearing the jade bracelet that she always wore. Sure, it was a common bracelet, the translucent jade band. I've seen it in practically every jewelry store. But it was chipped in exactly the same spot. Had she slept with them too? Was she showing off her other lovers, the other bodies she had invaded and nibbled, docile bodies like mine, companion bodies? Did she want me to know I wasn't the only one? How did she choose us? The softness of her skin, the sadness in her eyes. She smiled, her eyes crinkling, mimicking emotion. A line of blood fell like a tear from my nipple to my genitals. I was about to ask her who those girls were, floating in the shadows over the scraps of food, seraphic and fragile as sacrificial lambs. I was about to come, the darkness around me vibrating as if something calm and cruel, something that knows everything and wants to crush everything, were closing in. I actually just submitted 2 books,
Oh.
and now so I'm trying to avoid writing, which is really hard for me. But sometimes I really need to, because I always say one of my problems, which is also not a problem because it's my identity, I guess. But I always feel like I'm more a writer than a person, and so my whole life has always been filtered through writing, and I always felt like my main mission was narrating things more than living them. And so since I just sent my agent 2 books, now I'm just, whenever I feel like writing, I'm like, no, don't write, which can probably sound strange, but it's like I try to force myself to lean on the side of life more than on the side of writing. And this is also a mission for me. What I would say is just find your voice, forget about everything else, forget about what publishers want, what other people want, what the market seems to want. And it's all about your own voice. And the more personal it is, the more valuable it is, the more you forget whatever is around you. And the words that have been fed to you, the more you're gonna get closer to being, the writer you want to be.
Subscribe to a poetry magazine or 2 and alternate the ones you subscribe to. Find a local poetry writing group, and it's really important to have a trusted group of poet friends who you can workshop your poems with. Share your poems, get feedback, and more than anything, just read and read, and write in response to poems and poets that you like.
To piggyback a bit off what Viola said, I think the process you're finding your voice takes a while, and I think people find the pressure to have a fully refined voice when they're writing quite inhibitory, because you sit down and if you don't feel what you're writing is amazing, then you can kind of work yourself into a fluster and not write anything at all. And I think, consistency over quality in that respect. I think acknowledging that it's going to take a while to find your voice. Not everything has to be perfect, but as long as you write a bit when you can, then great things come out from the other end of consistency.